Hey guys, tonight we trudge into the narrow alleys of ancient Rome at first light, where 500,000 souls already jostle for space as the dawn mist lifts off tumbled garbage and animal dung. You inhale the tang of stale fish guts mingled with charred hearth smoke and see bread sellers hawking their day-old loaves to ragged children. You probably won't survive this morning's hustle without a strong stomach or a legionnaire's grit. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments so we can chart our sunrise together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By mainstream accounts, Rome at its height sprawled across 7 hills, with narrow winding streets teeming with carts, vendors, and stray dog that scavenged for scraps, often turning on unwary passers-by if hunger drove them. You step over a steaming heap of olive pits and crushed grapes, evidence of last night's tavern revelries, and nearly stumble on a loose paving stone that had claimed more than one ankle. Historians still argue whether Rome's famed road network, built for military precision, truly benefited ordinary citizens or primarily served political and martial elites. As the sun peaks between clay-tiled rooftops, you glance up to see flower pots balanced precariously on wooden balconies and laundry lines, crisscrossing the street like ropes in a gladiatorial cage. A fringe note in a street cleaner's log complains that some balconies were so overloaded with dripping laundry that sewage runoff mingled with filth in the gutters below, creating noxious backflows that residents call the River Tiber on the ground. Whether these rain-washed horrors were encountered daily or only after heavy storms remains a point of debate among urban archaeologists. You weave through a market square, its stalls piled high with fresh figs, garum sauces, and woven sandals, as a team of porters tug a heavily laden cart of amphorae, knocking elbows with toga-clad philosophers deep in debate. Mainstream sources record that Romans used public designated dump spots outside the city walls, yet lax enforcement meant much filth lingered in the streets. A satirical poem from a lesser-known poet quips better the sewers than your neighbor's hearth, hinting that personal waste disposal was more by reputation than regulation. Scholars still argue how effective Rome's sporadic street cleaning squads really were. Scattered across the square, temple priests chant rhythmic invocations to Jupiter, their voices competing with the clang of a blacksmith forging tools for dawn repairs. You catch a garlanded rooster dancing atop a low wall, likely a sacrificial bird gone rogue at last night's festival. Fringe lore suggests some devout Romans believed stray roosters carried the souls of dishonored men. Folklore historians still debate whether these superstitions influenced urban sanitation or remained quaint rural carryovers. Overhead pigeons wheel in circles, cooing hungrily, knowing that scraps from bakeries and butcher stalls guarantee breakfast. You notice a cluster of rooftop nests perched amid broken tiles. Public pigeons often thrived in every niche, their droppings bleaching marble and pestering censors. Mainstream architects lamented that sacred monuments and statues suffered from constant avian erosion, prompting occasional pigeon patrols armed with willow brooms. Yet some culinary enthusiasts prized pigeon meat so highly they welcomed the flocks, another scholarly debate vermin or precious food source. Amid the human and animal bustle, you hear a low rumble as water flows through an open gutter, part of the city's aqueduct-fed drainage, carrying fresh water and waste alike. You lean over to peer in and catch a glimpse of small fish that had somehow swum upstream, a fringe phenomenon reported by a few curious naturalists who marveled at fish surviving in the stinking runoff. Mainstream engineers claimed the aqueducts kept water separate, but occasional mixing into drains sparked debate over maintenance lapses and public health risks. You navigate past a group of dock workers carrying ceramic water jars, dolia off a merchant's cart, their leather straps chafing across sweat-soaked shoulders. They laugh and curse as a piglet scampers between their feet, no stranger in a world where animals and humans vied for every inch of space. Historians still argue whether urban livestock, sheep-goats, pigs, and chickens roamed freely by design, providing meat and milk at every turn, or simply due to lax property rules that left city alleys overrun. As you approach the forum's marble columns, morning orators begin their speeches on politics and philosophy. You pause to watch, mindful that without Roman citizenship and proper attire, you'd be shunned or even arrested. Mainstream laws reserved public speech for elite males. Fringe accounts hint that some clever slaves disguised themselves in borrowed togas to catch political rumors, though historians still debate how widespread such masquerades truly were. The sun climbs higher, and you sense the smell intensify, sweat smoke and sewage convergence, reminding you that surviving a day in Rome required more than curiosity. It demanded nimble feet, quick wits, and perhaps a sturdy cloak to mask the odor. Because in the Roman Empire, city life was a symphony of civilization and chaos, a place where marvels and miseries walked hand in hand, and only those hardened by its relentless hustle could hope to endure beyond sunrise. You slip through a narrow gateway marked by faded frescoes of snarling beasts and step into the shadow-streaked courtyard of a ludus gladiatorius, Rome's infamous gladiatorial school. Sweat-slicked walls rise around you, echoing with the metallic ring of weapons being sharpened and the low growl of men in training. You trudge across the uneven stone floor, every footstep sending up a swirl of dusty sand. In this brutal arena of preparation, a single day's survival is a distant hope, because now it is time for Gladiatorial School Shock. In mainstream Roman practice, the ludus was where condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and volunteers, known as octorati, were schooled in the arts of combat. You pass rows of wooden dummies, their straw-stuffed torsos scarred by repeated glancing blows, and see a group of novices sparring under the watchful eye of a grizzled trainer, a murmillo, his helmet's crest gleaming in a shaft of sunlight. Mainstream sources confirm that these schools, funded by wealthy sponsors, disciplined trainees, not only in sword and net, but in strict routines of diet, exercise, and rote drills designed to mold raw recruits into spectacle-ready warriors. Yet amid the official regimen fringe, whispers spoke of secret midnight drills where masters held unsanctioned bouts by torchlight. A graffiti-carved inscription on a nearby wall warns, "Beware Ulter's lash when the moon is full." Historians still argue whether such nocturnal sparring was a covert tradition passed down among trainers or merely the fanciful exaggeration of bored spectators seeking thrills after dusk. You move closer to a lined row of training weapons, gladius replicas, tridents, and wooden shields worn smooth by constant drills. A fellow trainee, his shoulders bruised and cane-like, leans against a pillar to catch his breath. He tells you in hushed tones that newcomers often underestimated the school's pace. On your first day, they make you jog the perimeter until your lungs burn, then force you to wield a 7-pound wooden sword until your arms collapse. Such extreme endurance training, a mainstream fact noted in the writings of Martial, prepared gladiators for exhaustive bouts. However, a stray entry in a physician's notebook from Pompeii records that some recruits collapsed unconscious from heat stroke, raising debate over whether medical staff properly monitored these rituals or shrugged them off as part of the rite. Nearby, you spot a battered tablet nailed to a post, inscribed with daily rations. 2 pounds of barley porridge, a handful of olives, and half a cup of diluted goat's milk. Trainers insisted this gladiator diet fueled lean muscle growth while toughening digestive systems against shock. Mainstream archaeological findings at gladiatorial barracks confirm bone isotopes matching high carbohydrate diets. Yet a fringe theory argues that certain Lanista gladiator managers secretly doped trainees with dried plant extracts like henbane to heighten aggression, a claim drawn from a single cryptic medical papyrus. Scholars still debate whether these psychoactive stimulants truly circulated in the ludus or existed only in the realm of rumor. As you navigate a narrow corridor, the air grows hotter and thicker, scented with sweat and rubbed oil. You pass a wooden rack bearing curved blades, psyche, designed to slash an opponent's flank. A trainer, his eyes hard as flint, wields one in demonstration, its steel gleaming menacingly. "If you can't parry your own shadow, you'll die by dawn," he growls. This tough love approach reflects mainstream training manuals emphasizing muscle memory and reflex. Yet an obscure marginal note scratched into the wall hints that some trainers favored live animal drills, forcing novices to strike at tethered boars to practice aim. And unverified practice historians still argue over due to sparse evidence. You step into a low-ceilinged feeding hall where trainees gulp watered wine and tear at coarse bread after a grueling morning session. Laughter and curses mingle as men rest their blunted weapons against the benches. One veteran, scarred across his cheek, warns you don't show weakness. A single falter, and the lanista sells you off for scraps to the best bidder. This fringe cruelty underscores the gladiatorial commerce beneath the spectacle. Injured or unimpressive fighters were traded rapidly. Historians still debate whether such selling occurred routinely or remained isolated acts by unscrupulous managers. The courtyard's far corner hosts a makeshift infirmary, an arched niche with straw pallets and bowls of vinegar for cleaning wounds. You glimpse a medic bandaging a novice's gash, its edges jagged from a misthrown wooden spear. Mainstream medical texts from Galen's school describe protocols for cleaning wounds and preventing infection, applying boiled wine and covering with fresh linen. Yet a fleeting diary entry from a trainee complains that the vinegar stung so fiercely it felt like being branded by Vulcan's forge, suggesting patients often endured pain beyond the blade's bite. Scholars still argue whether medicaments were administered compassionately or used as crude deterrents against future mistakes. As the sun dips low, a trainer calls everyone to formation for one last drill, a synchronized flurry of thrusts, parries, and shouts. You stand in a line, heart-pounding, wooden sword raised. With each command you lunge and twist, sweat stinging your eyes. Your arms burn, your lungs cry for mercy, and yet the trainer's whistle forces you on. You realize then that surviving a day in this school demanded more than skill. It required unbreakable will. Because in the Roman Empire, the gladiatorial school was not just a place of spectacle, it was a crucible of endurance, where unprepared novices met the sand's harsh verdict within hours, and only the toughest, most cunning fighters lasted beyond sunrise. You follow your aching limbs out of the ludus and slip into a dimly lit triclinium, a bustling dining hall where reclining diners lounge on low couches arranged around shallow tables. The scent of spiced dormice, honeyed wine, and cooling garum sauce hangs heavy in the air. You trudge past servants, balancing plates of flamingo tongues, jelly molded from ostrich eggs, and boiled dormice rolled in poppy seed honey. In this opulent feast of the empire, an unprepared guest risked far more than indigestion, because now it is time for dining dangers and vomitoria. In mainstream Roman culinary practice, wealthy hosts lavished their banquets with exotic delicacies: peacock brains, snails fattened on milk, and snails farmed in garden beds. Each course arrived with theatrical flourish as guests reclined on elbow-propped couches, towel poised to dab savory drips from their chins. To prolong feasting, some diners practiced vomitoria, deliberate vomiting between courses in small niches called vomitoria, so they could consume more wine and seafood without feeling stuffed. Historians still argue whether these niches were widespread formal features or mere corridor exits later misnamed by satirists. Yet amid the grandeur lay true hazards. A fringe anecdote from Petronius's lost banquet memoir describes a guest who overestimated his constitution, inducing a violent purge so massive that he collapsed into one vomitorium and was mistaken for a decorative ruin, only rescued when the next party demanded the Nietzsche's statue be removed. Scholars still debate whether Petronius's satirical sketches reflect genuine excesses or authorial hyperbole aimed at mocking elite decadence. As you recline on a plush couch draped in embroidered linen, a slave pours you a small goblet of aged Falernian wine. The vintage's potency registers immediately, its heady aroma of figs and resin swirling with pungent hints of salt. Mainstream sources note that Roman wines often exceeded 12% alcohol, occasionally fortified with seawater or resin to intensify flavor. Yet a tantalizing fringe recipe in a rural winemaker's scroll suggests some vintners added crushed mandrake root to induce mild visions, a practice quickly banned by magistrates. Scholars still argue whether mandrake-infused wine ever adorned patrician tables or remained a rustic novelty. You nibble on a silver dish of dormice glazed with honey and poppy seeds. These little rodents, raised in ceramic jars called gliraria, were considered a delicacy, a mainstream custom attested by Apicius's cookbook. However, a marginal note by an overworked cook warns that undercooked dormice sometimes harbored tapeworm cysts, risking intestinal parasites for unsuspecting guests. Historians still debate whether dormice-induced infections were common enough to spur butchers to adopt stricter roasting methods, or if they remained rare episodes obscured by culinary pride. Across the room, musicians strike pipes and percussion to entertain the diners, their gentle rhythms punctuating the murmur of conversations in Latin, Greek, and provincial dialect. You watch as two senators argue softly about grain distributions in Sicily, oblivious to the smoking incense burners drifting above them. Fringe theater troupes sometimes parodied such debates by staging faux brawls at banquets, prompting magistrates to ban performances in dining halls, though some playbills boast nightly comedic clashes. Scholars still argue whether these theatrical interludes enhanced conviviality or risked real violence among rival patrons. A slave brings a small marble basin, a portable vomitorium, and discreetly places it behind your couch. You feel a subtle pressure in your stomach as the next course arrives: boiled ostrich eggs stuffed with minced dormouse meat and scented with cumin. Mainstream gourmand guides caution that overeagerness could overwhelm one's digestion, hence the availability of vomitoria. Yet an unflattering graffiti fragment in a Pompeian house scrawls, "He who vomits twice for fish pays thrice in shame," suggesting social stigma could accompany repeated purges. Scholars still debate how public or private such ritual vomitings truly were, and whether they belonged to elite identity or clandestine practice. As the feast continues, a garum-laced sauce spills onto your tunic. You dab at it only to discover the pungent fish paste has already seeped through, leaving a mottled stain. Mainstream laundry recipes recommend soaking stained garments in fermented urine, a common source of ammonia, before rinsing with river water. Yet a fringe remedy offered by traveling dyers advocated a paste of crushed fig leaves, which occasionally turned tunics a ghastly green. Historians still argue whether fig-based dyes ever rivaled ammonia's cleaning power or remained dismissed by conservative housewives. A jovial toast erupts when a tray of sweet cakes dusted with rosewater arrives accompanied by a precious saucer of small passum grapes soaked in wine. The host raises a ceremonial goblet and declaims May Neptune favor our nets, and Ceres bless our granaries. Yet a fringe sect of Veti mystery cults whispered that including garlicky pastries in toasts invited Hecate's protective spirits, a belief recorded only in scattered esoteric letters. Scholars still debate whether culinary invocations ever merged state religion with local folk gods or remained isolated curiosities. As the candles gutter low, the host signals a final wine flurry unmixed, Falernian poured over snow and served as a chilled mixture known as Nyx libations. These icy pours, mainstream in summer banquets, required servants to haul snow from mountain peaks in elite extravagance. Yet a provincial count's ledger laments that imitated Nyx made from salted ice, harvested from brackish springs, left guests tasting the sea. Historians still argue whether such sea ice fiascos were common missteps or isolated gaffes turned into exaggerated anecdotes. You lean back, stomach groaning, and glance toward the vomitorium with reluctant acceptance. The final indulgence, honeyed cakes and last draught of wine, unsettles your stomach. You slip from your couch, place your hand on the marble basin's rim, and feel the cool smoothness under your palm. Because in the Roman Empire, dining was not merely eating, it was a ritual of excess identity and risk, where the line between pleasure and peril blurred, and only those hardened by its opulent dangers could hope to survive beyond one decadent course. You leave the banquet's lingering grape-sweet haze behind and slip into the steamy embrace of Rome's grand thermae, public bathhouses, where the day's grime and gossip alike are scrubbed away. You trudge across polished marble floors, slick with water and fallen olive oil, your sandals echoing in arches that rise like temples to leisure. Steam coils around Corinthian columns, and the scent of cedarwood mats mingles with sweat and soapy lather. You probably won't survive these bathhouse rituals without slipping, sliding, or worse, a pickpocket's deft hand in the suds. By mainstream run custom, thermae offered a 3-stage sequence: the caldarium hot room, the tepidarium warm room, and the frigidarium cold plunge. You first enter the caldarium, where heated floors and enveloping steam open your pores. The attendant douses you with scalding water from a bronze ladle, and you feel your skin flush in response. This mainstream practice, described by Vitruvius and witnessed in countless archaeological bath complexes, was believed to cleanse impurities, improve circulation, and ready the body for deeper relaxation. Yet amid this cleansing came real dangers. Fringe reports from a 2nd century satirist claim that caldarium floors heated by hypocausts sometimes reached such blistering temperatures that unsuspecting bathers burned their souls, forcing them to hop from tile to tile in comical agony. Historians still argue whether these scorching mishaps were one-off engineering failures or a routine hazard so common that public notices once warned patrons to test the floor with a cautious toe. You trudge into the tepidarium, next its gentler warmth, a balm to overstressed muscles. Here you recline on a low bench, carved from rose-red granite, and a slave performs a strigil scrape. He coats your body in sweet-smelling oil, then scrapes it away with a curved metal blade, lifting sweat dirt and dead skin. Mainstream physicians praised the strigil as an effective exfoliant that prevented skin ailments and invigorated the flesh. Yet a passing graffiti in a side chamber mockingly advises, trust your friend, not a stranger's strigil, unless you enjoy unintended tattoo removal. Scholars still debate whether strigil-related cuts were common enough to inspire stricter licensing of bath attendants, or remained the target of witty graffiti alone. From there you wander toward the frigidarium, a vast pool of icy water shaded by mosaic-tiled walls. As you step in, the shock lances up your legs, your breath catching like a startled chariot at full tilt. Patrons gasp in unison, then laugh at their shared display of endurance. This sudden cold plunge was mainstream medicine's answer to sealing pores, fortifying the body against chills, and sharpening the mind repeated daily by industrious traders before market hours. Yet a curious footnote in a late-period physician's handbook warns that too many rapid plunges in succession could trigger spasms or even cardiac distress in older bathers. Historians still argue whether such medical admonitions altered popular frigidarium rituals or were largely ignored in favor of tradition. As you emerge dripping, you blot yourself with a thick woolen towel and wander into the palaestra, a colonnaded exercise yard adjacent to the baths. Here bathers wrestle lightly, practice javelin throws with wooden shafts, or jog around a shallow track. Mainstream fitness guides of the time touted these activities as vital complements to bathing, preventing stiffness and encouraging healthy physique. Yet a fringe anecdote from a disgruntled pensions administrator notes that some bathgoers used weighted sandals of lead to accelerate strength gains, only to suffer twisted ankles and ruined manuscripts when they stumbled in nearby libraries. Scholars still debate whether such extreme fitness hacks ever gained a serious traction or existed merely as prankish lore. Nearby, an apoditarium undressing room hums with chatter as you strip to a loincloth and entrust your belongings to a bronze-chained locker, its key held by a scrupulous slave. Mainstream bathhouse regulations required a deposit equal to 1 day's wage for key retrieval, but a stray court record from Ostia records that a clever thief once copied locker numbers and stole valuables at night, leaving bathers with nothing but wet tunics. Historians still argue whether bathhouse theft was endemic, prompting guards in heavy fibulae, or largely curtailed by strict entry controls. As you meander back toward the caldarium for a final rinse, you pass a shrine to Neptune, where patrons toss small bronze coins as offerings for good health and safe passage home. The mainstream religious custom underscores how bathing blended hygiene with spiritual ritual. Yet a less formal tradition saw sailors inscribing tiny prayers on folded sherds and slipping them into drain grates. These pluviaria notes, part fringe, folk magic, suggested bathers believed the water's flow carried prayers to gods below. Scholars still debate whether such votive drain prayers ever influenced official temple offerings or persisted only as quiet personal gestures. The final obstacle lies in the exit corridor, where steamy air meets chilly drafts. You nearly slip on damp marble, clutching an oil-soaked bench for support. A bath attendant chuckles as he offers a fragrant myrtle sprig to freshen your nostrils. Mainstream aromatherapy guides recommended sprigs of laurel rosemary or mint to cleanse the spirit after communal bathing. Yet a prankster once rigged a sprig with crushed peppercorns, sending unsuspecting bathers into fits of sneezing. Historians still argue whether pepper sprig antics were common, prompting some bathhouses to ban pepper near exit stations or confined to mischievous apprentices. As you step out into the sunlit forum courtyard, your skin tingles, your muscles hum, and you realize that surviving Rome's bathhouses required more than a towel. It demanded nimble feet, alert senses, and the willingness to endure scalding steam, stinging strigils, and frigid shocks, all in pursuit of cleanliness and status. Because in the Roman Empire, the thermae were not just places to wash, they were arenas of social ritual, health experiments, and everyday hazards, testing the mettle of every bather bold enough to enter their steamy embrace. You slip away from the circling bathers and wind down a shaded portico toward Rome's beating heart, the Forum, where flags snap in the breeze and marble columns glint in the sun. Voices rise in heated debate, mingling with the clang of merchants unloading amphorae and the distant bleat of a sacrificial goat. You trudge past senators draped in togas, their sandals scuffed and brows furrowed as a cluster of plebeians jostles the balcony above. In the center of power and oratory, violence can erupt as swiftly as a thunderbolt, because now it is time for forum faction fights. In mainstream political life, Rome's populous forum was not only a marketplace and court, but a stage for factional showdowns. Senators aligned with rival factions, optimates and populares used robed orators to sway crowds backed by gangs of rowdy supporters called collegia. You see a troop of marble-clad nobles ascend the rostra, their heralds calling for silence, then shout decrees about grain distributions or foreign wars. This ritualized oratory, detailed by Cicero and Tacitus, formed the backbone of Republican politics and early empire governance, where public opinion could be as potent as any legion's might. Yet fringe scrawls in nearby graffiti alleys tell of more clandestine tactics. Beware Candidus's thugs. He pays them in cheap wine to rough up rival speakers. Historians still argue whether these paid muscle squads were officially sanctioned extensions of political clubs or rogue bands operating under private auspices, blurring the line between lawful debate and outright street brawls. You skirt past a group of toga-clad youths brandishing staves carved with their patron's symbol, a snarling wolf for one faction, an oak leaf for another. Mainstream edicts forbade open-armed conflict within the city's sacred spaces, yet magistrates often turned a blind eye, relying on ceding curia orders rather than force. A fringe memoir by a former tribune recalls that on one autumn day, a brawl spilled onto the Senate steps when supporters of two consular candidates hurled benches and overturned altars, an incident so chaotic that even the Vestal virgins fled in alarm. Scholars still debate whether that single catastrophe led to stricter crowd controls or simply became legend in senatorial lore. Ahead you glimpse a small enclave where grain dole recipients gather their fingers greasy from stale bread. Politicians often appealed to them for votes by promising free rations, mainstream practice codified under the Lex Frumentaria. Yet fringe rumors accuse some demagogues of substituting watered-down grain mixed with chaff, provoking near riots when poor families discovered the fraud. Historians still argue whether these adulterations were isolated scams or symptomatic of deeper corruption in Rome's food supply chain. As you navigate closer to the Temple of Saturn, a sudden shout rings out. Two rival speakers, one championing tax relief, the other denouncing foreign entanglements, leap from the rostra, and their followers surge forward. Staves clash on marble togas, rip, and shouts drown the temple's bell. You back away heart-pounding as a stray sandal slams into your ankle. Mainstream accounts note that every high-stakes speech risked devolving into mob violence, prompting some orators to carry hidden daggers for protection. Yet a fragmentary police report from 27 BCE complains that consular guards often stood idle, unwilling to arrest citizens in sacred precincts. Scholars still debate whether magistrates preferred political chaos to risking the sanctity of Rome's religious spaces. In the melee, you glimpse a well-known tribune, his distaff cloak torn, shouting for calm, while a group of armored lictors forms a protective circle. This fringe display of force arming lictors with heavy rods emerged in turbulent times, though mainstream sources insist lictors carried only light fasces as symbolic authority. Historians still argue whether those reinforced fasces were a temporary measure during crises or exaggerated by satirical poets. Nearby, a line of merchants huddles beside collapsed pottery jars, their wares trampled underfoot. A disconsolate trader curses as freedmen in silk tunics strip olives from smashed jars to salvage the vat oil. Mainstream regulations allowed compensation claims for property damage during civil disturbances, but a fringe legal brief from a distressed merchant laments that court fees and bribery often swallowed any award. Scholars still debate how effectively the courts protected small traders caught in factional crossfire. You dart past a cluster of scribes and heralds, recording names of those arrested for disorder charges, ranging from disturbing public worship to bearing arms within sacred precincts. A fringe pamphlet circulating among craftsmen claims that the Scribe Guild sometimes manipulated records, erasing sympathizers from arrest lists while inflating fines for rivals. Historians still debate whether such clerical corruption ever reached systemic levels or remained the murmurs of disgruntled petitioners. As you near the Temple of Concord, the air crackles with tension. An orator's final volley, promising debt relief for the poor, ignites fresh fury. Fists pound marble thresholds, and coins rain from startled onlookers. You slip into a side street, breath-ragged sandals, sticky with spilled wine and olive oil. In your pocket, the weight of a single denarius feels like both a promise of purchase and a bribe for protection. Because in the Roman Empire, the Forum's gilded grandeur masked a volatile arena where factional fights erupted in an instant, where words wielded as weapons could ignite real violence, and only those nimble of foot and steely of nerve could hope to survive beyond a single speech. You slip away from the Forum's chaos and step onto a narrow street where the roar of hooves and the thunder of chariot wheels drown out even the calls of street vendors. Dust billows in your face as racers in tunics trimmed with vivid colors whip their mounts toward the Circus Maximus. You cling to the stone wall, heart-hammering, as a 4-horse chariot, its driver leaning far left, roars past with frightening speed. You probably won't last a single block on foot in this whirlwind of iron-rimmed wheels and snorting horses, because now it is time for chariot traffic mayhem. In mainstream Roman transportation, chariots weren't just for the circus. They served as everyday conveyances for couriers, merchants, and even magistrates hurrying to official duties. Streets like the Via Sacra and Via Lata pulsed with chariot traffic from dawn's first light. You see a wooden, two-wheeled carriage drawn by a pair of restless Andalusian horses, its driver urging them onward with a leather thong. Archaeological inscriptions confirm that factions of charioteers firmly associated with colors like reds, blues, greens, and whites rented out vehicles for hire, ensuring that any well-heeled citizen could dash across the city in style. Yet this convenience came at a deadly cost. Fringe graffiti found near the Sabura warns, "Beware the Green Faction's courier. He cares more for speed than your spine." Historians still argue whether such renegade drivers operated outside official regulations, or if magistrates simply lacked resources to police every reckless coachman. Some scholars suggest that roadside shrines to Liber Pater sprang up at accident black spots in an attempt to placate injured travelers. Clutching the rough marble wall, you watch as a chariot bearing a crimson-vested dispatch rider clips a corner too sharply. The chariot's wheel catches on a cobblestone, jolting the rider headfirst into the street. He scrambles up, robes torn and dusted, with grit dusts himself off, and clambers back aboard without pausing. This mainstream display of Roman stoicism, the expectation that one simply remounts and continues, is noted in contemporary letters. Yet a solitary coroner's notice, unearthed in Herculaneum, laments that some victims never remounted their broken bodies, left staining the stones. Scholars still debate whether such quick recoveries were heroic myth or the grim reality of underreported fatalities. As you edge forward, a merchant's cart laden with oil amphorae barrels toward you. The charioteer, sensing a rival in a white-striped tunic behind him, leans forward, urging his horses with cruel efficiency. Their hooves clip against overturned pottery, sending shards scattering like broken promises. Mainstream records of urban planning reveal attempts to widen key thoroughfares, yet habit and property rights kept most streets narrow. Frenetic chariot traffic and stationary carts often collided in deadly gridlock, a hazard cited by municipal edicts that limited high-speed travel during market hours. Yet taste for speed frequently trumped safety, and officials rarely enforced restrictions. You scramble across the road as two crimson chariots barrel past their wheels, mere inches from your ankles. A stray whip crack echoes as a driver corrects his horses, mainstream technique taught in the imperial riding schools to handle rearing mounts. But fringe accounts from a gladiator-turned-charioteer describe a training method so severe that novices were tied to wagons and dragged around the track until they begged for mercy. Historians still argue whether such cruel drills informed public driving technique or perished as whispered horrors among the faded sands of the circus. Suddenly, a child's scream cuts through the cacophony. A runaway goat, spooked by a passing chariot, darts into your path. You leap back, colliding with a wooden post. A 4-horse coach laden with silken goods barely misses you, horses snorting steam as their hooves spark against the stone. Mainstream cautionary pamphlets advise citizens to avoid wearing loose garments near busy roads, lest they catch on passing axles, but few followed such sensible advice in their haste. Yet a dusty tavern poster once offered a reward for anyone who could safely lead a team of racing horses through the market unscathed, sparking debates about whether the risk was worth the potential prize. A gang of street urchins darts out, grabbing the trailing ribbons on a chariot harness. The startled horses yank the vehicle sideways, tipping a basket of figs onto the cobbles. Mainstream legal codes prescribe harsh penalties for endangering horses, yet fringe testimonies record magistrates tossing only a small fine at the boy's guardian who bribed his way out. Scholars still argue whether juvenile mischief on the roads was met with justice or simply became another whisper in Rome's ceaseless din. You sprint the final dozen feet to a narrow shop doorway and scramble inside, heart-pounding. Outside, the chariots thunder on, indifferent to the mayhem and the near misses. Your cloak is smeared with dust, your sandals scuffed, and your nerves frayed. Because in the Roman Empire, navigating city streets was not merely commuting, it was a high-stakes gamble where speed, skill, and street smarts determined survival, and only the swiftest or most fortunate travelers escaped the roar of chariot traffic by anything more than a sliver of stone. You slip away from the roar of chariots and duck into the shadowed passage beside a sprawling public latrine, a cavernous hall of stone benches pockmarked with keyhole openings and lined with masonry channels beneath. The air here is thick with steamy humidity and an unmistakable tang that makes your nostrils flare. You trudge across damp flagstones slick with algae, your sandals squelching, and glance around at the dozen patrons perched side-by-side shoulders, brushing as they attend nature's call. You probably won't last more than an hour in the Roman Empire if your stomach isn't ironclad, because now it is time for sewage and sanitation perils. In mainstream Roman engineering cities, channeled household waste and rainwater into vast sewer systems, most famously the Cloaca Maxima, designed to carry effluent from latrines, kitchens, and baths away from public spaces. Above you, limestone vaults curve toward the open sky, punctuated by small apertures to release steam. On either side, long stone benches with keyhole seats stand over shallow watercourses. Romans believed continuous flows kept maladies at bay, and municipal records confirm regular maintenance. Crews dredged the sewers to prevent blockages. Yet amid these marvels lay real hazards. Fringe reports from a graffiti-covered wall near the Tiber bank warn beware. The cloaca's hidden mouth kids lost chariots in its gaping maw. Historians still argue whether such tales of runaway goods slipping into sewer grates were literal accidents or satirical jabs at Rome's overconfidence in its infrastructure. You lower yourself onto a seat carved with worn edges, the chill of the marble seeping through your tunic. Nearby, a bather washes his feet in the open gutter oblivious to the swirl of detritus olive pits, broken amphora shards, and disturbingly stray rodents. Mainstream guides for the wealthy advised using personal sponges on sticks known as tersoria, dipped in vinegar water to wipe, then rinsed in fresh running water. Yet a jaded vendor's ledger from Ostia grumbles that some tavern owners reused sponges for weeks, risking cross-contamination. Scholars still debate how strictly the well-heeled adhered to hygienic best practices versus cutting corners to save bronze. As you finish, you reach for the communal tersorium, a sponge affixed to a wooden pole, and pause. Sweat beads on your brow. A fringe rumor asserts that certain criminal gangs in the Subura would slip poison into latrine sponges intended for elite bathhouses, targeting rivals in the steamy glades of Caldaria. Historians still argue whether any documented poisonings ever occurred, or if the threat was mere underworld legend. After rinsing the sponge in the gutter's flow, you step onto the damp flagstones and head for the sluice outlet, a small grated tunnel where water cascades into a deeper channel. You crouch to examine the current, murky brown flecked with leaves, blood-dark fish, and occasional slithering eels carried from the Tiber upriver. Mainstream sanitation engineers insisted that the gradient of drains prevented backflow, yet fringe complaints in the forum's petition rolls report rancid flooding at dawn after heavy rains dragging latrine waste into street corners. Scholars still debate how often sewers overflowed and whether magistrates blamed poor maintenance or unprecedented storms. Emerging from the latrine hall, you nearly slip on a slick patch of algae-coated stone. A passerby glances at your sandals and smirks a shared nod of resignation. Bathhouse and latrine floors alike were notorious for such hazards. Mainstream civic edicts mandated that idols oversee weekly street cleaning, but enforcement was spotty. A solitary plaque in a decaying alley beseeched citizens, "Beware winter slime, take heed or break a shin." Historians still argue whether public admonitions translated into real safety measures or merely endeavored to shame negligent stewards. As you wind toward the next street, you notice a cluster of children playing near a drain opening, tossing scraps of bread, and watching tiny fish flit in the current. Their laughter echoes off high walls. Yet a faded notice on a nearby pillar warns that sewers were home to folliculi small sewer rats, carriers of plague and typhoid. Mainstream medical texts attribute epidemic outbreaks to such rodent hosts, reinforcing the city's fear of underground vermin. However, some fringe scholars in late imperial times suggested that miasma theory polluted vapors from stagnant drains played at least as large a role as rodents, a debate unresolved until modern germ theory took hold. You pause at the edge of a shallow canal where spilled wine from a drunken reveler has created a sticky sheen. Servants scrape the residue With wooden paddles at dawn, the runoff swept into the sewers for final disposal. Mainstream urban manuals praised this ritual, but a disgruntled merchant's diary laments that heavy draining sometimes pulled wine and oil from cellars by suction, draining valuable reserves into the drains. Did these suction events really devastate storage cellars, or were they exaggerated laments? Historians still argue the true scale of such subterranean mishaps. Finally, you stand beneath the arches of a raised aqueduct, its piers flanking a drainage channel that spills clear water alongside murkier flows. The juxtaposition encapsulates Roman sanitation's dual nature, fresh water delivered by miles-long channels above, while waste rushed away below. Yet, as a stray wind carries the mingled scents of both, you feel a shiver, because in the Roman Empire, even the marvels of engineering teemed with perils, where sewers both cleansed and threatened, where communal latrines invited convenience and contagion alike, and only those who navigated every slippery step and swirling current could hope to endure another sunrise. You slip past the stench of the latrine and the bustle of the forum winding into the outskirts, where rows of chained wagons and stone quarries stretch under the noon sun. Here beyond the city's marble shine, you encounter the relentless grind of slave labor, the backbone of Roman wealth and infrastructure. You trudge along narrow dirt paths, pitted with hoof prints, and laden with the clink of shackles against tool handles, as masters and overseers drive men, women, and children through grueling tasks. Because now it is time for slave labor exhaustion. In mainstream Roman economy, slaves powered agriculture, mining, construction, and domestic service. You pass a field where slaves stoop beneath the yoke of heavy baskets, harvesting olives under the sweltering sun. Nearby, a gang of cane-clad men hacks at marble blocks in a quarry, each swing of the pickaxe gouging deep trenches in the stone. Ancient writers like Varro record that slaves working in Sardinia's mines labored 12-hour days, their backs bent under brutal quotas. Yet a few masters provided modest breaks and nourishing porridge, small mercies noted in papyrus letters from distant provinces. Yet in fringe whisperings among runaway fugitives, tales circulated of canicula work shifts, dog days in midsummer, when overseers reduced water rations to toughen spirits. A graffiti scrawl found near a villa wall reads, "Beware the master's slipper in July." Historians still argue whether such dehydration tactics were systematic cruelty or sporadic misjudgments by sadistic overseers. You trudge on past a carriage carrying a wealthy landowner whose face remains cool beneath a linen cap, oblivious to the chain gangs lining the road. Behind him, slaves mounted on mules carry heavy amphorae of wine from provincial vineyards to city markets. This transport role mainstream across the empire offered slightly better conditions, yet escort duty could turn lethal if bandits attacked. Fringe reports tell of entire muleteer crews slaughtered on the Via Egnatia, their wine-laden mules stampeding into gorges. Scholars still debate the true frequency of such raids versus the routine perils of overburdened routes. Ahead, the sound of hammers on chisel echoes from a cliff face. Slave artisans skilled in sculpting and stonework undertake delicate reliefs for public monuments. These craftspeople, often educated Greeks or captured specialists, enjoyed relative autonomy, their labor commanded by contracts in stone. Yet a shadowy account in a rhetorician's scroll warns that some masters poisoned skilled slaves to avoid paying promised manumission bonuses, a fringe atrocity scholars still argue occurred more than once. In a makeshift camp, exhausted field hands beside tattered tents, their bodies glistening with sweat and dust. They share crusts of hard bread flavored with olives and sip from a small goatskin water sack. Mainstream accounts in Cato's agricultural treatises instruct overseers to provide these basics to maintain productivity. Yet an illicit diary smuggled from a provincial estate laments that corrupt managers diverted provisions to their own tables, leaving slaves to fend for rats and weeds. Historians still debate the scale of such provisioning scandals and their impact on slave mortality. As the sun beats down, overseers drive the throng up steep terraces where peasants once labored freely. Now, chained shoulder to hip, slaves shoulder massive stones to reinforce terracing walls. Many collapse before sunset, only to have comrades drag them to infirmary wagons. There, a medic, typically another slave with basic training, douses injuries with vinegar and applies compressed bandages of wool. Mainstream medical papyri note that such rudimentary care saved lives, but often only a handful, as chronic wounds and infections claimed the weakest. Fringe evidence in surgical scroll marginalia hints at experimental salves of crushed lead ore tried once and abandoned when patients grew delirious. Scholars still argue whether these early proto-pharmaceutical trials influenced later medical chemistry. A sudden shout rises as a young slave, dreaming of escape, loosens her bonds to sprint toward a thicket. Overseers sound their whistles, and a pack of mastiffs bursts forth. The girl is caught by the hound's jaws before she reaches cover. The master's wife, watching from a chariot oversight bench, shakes her head. In mainstream legal codes, running away warranted corporal punishment, flogging, branding, or worse. Yet fringe petitions to the emperor sometimes pleaded for leniency in honor of a fugitive's youth or service. Historians still debate whether such imperial clemency ever truly freed culled victims. You skirt past the mastiff ring and emerge onto a dusty road leading back toward the city gates. The sight of well-dressed citizens lounging on couches in open-air cafes jars against the memory of bloodied feet and broken bodies behind you. Slaves numbering in the millions across the empire sustained every stone and loaf in Rome, yet endured exhaustion few could imagine. Because in the Roman Empire, slave labor was not mere servitude. It was a grueling testament to human endurance and exploitation, where only those with iron wills or fate's mercy survived the relentless grind from dawn to dusk. You move from the dusty quarries into the manicured grounds of the Castra Praetoria, Rome's formidable imperial guard camp, where ranks of white-tunicked recruits march in precise lines beneath fluttering standards. The roar of shouted commands ricochets off stone walls, and the scent of boiled lentils mingles with the sharp tang of polished metal. You trudge along the gravel path as centurions pace and prowl, their eyes cold with expectation. Today's drill schedule will crush any man unprepared for the empire's rigor, because now it is time for military drill discipline. In mainstream Roman military practice, new legionaries underwent a strict regimen: dawn to dusk marches, weapons drills, formation exercises, and fortification work. You watch as recruits heft the pilum, a heavy throwing spear across shoulder, then practice the thrust in unison, shields locked like overlapping scales. Ancient manuals by Vegetius instruct on precise footwork and shield wall cohesion, ensuring each soldier knew his place in the famed testudo formation. This disciplined training forged units capable of withstanding ambushes and outmaneuvering foes. Yet among the hissing atmospheres of camp life, fringe accounts hint at more brutal rites, an oft-whispered midnight obstacle course, where recruits ran barefoot over broken tiles to test endurance, while centurions lobbed javelins overhead to simulate battlefield chaos. Historians still argue whether such extreme night drills were institutionalized or remained rogue practices by harsh commanders. As noon sun climbs, you trudge beside a line of recruits carrying full kit armor, shield pilum, and provisions on an 8-mile march to the nearby defensive wall. Each step drives tired calves into protest, yet any slack pace draws a centurion's vicious curse and lash. Mainstream accounts verify that march speeds ranged from 20 to 30 Roman miles in 5 days, an astonishing feat of logistics and endurance. Yet a fleeting entry in a physician's journal notes recruits fainted from heat stroke during the peak of summer, sparking debates over whether medical support kept pace with martial demands. Upon reaching the testudo practice area, you join a phalanx-style drill. Shields interlock overhead, muting the sun, and you trudge forward, feet scraping stones in unison as a shower of wooden darts falls around you. The sensation is claustrophobic. Your back strains beneath the weight of overlapping scuta. Mainstream training emphasized testudo for siege assaults. Yet fringe reports claim some centurions used live arrows in final trials, an allegation historians still debate for lack of concrete evidence, though veteran memoirs echo similar tales of bloodied tunics. Afterward, you trudge to the armory, where recruits strip and subject battered limbs to a medic's care. A staff of Medici washes wounds with wine and applies cooling poultices of vinegar and dill standard field medicine noted by Galen. Yet an anonymous letter found in Vindolanda warns that some Medici injected diluted honey into deep cuts to ward off evil spirits, a fringe remedy scholars still debate as folk superstition or early antiseptic experimentation. Late afternoon brings shield wall tests, where two cohorts clash shields in controlled melees, monitor centurions calling blows and recording failures. Any recruit who drops his shield or breaks formation drinks raw vinegar as punishment, a mainstream disciplinary measure thought to cleanse both body and spirit. Yet a derogatory epitaph scratched into the practice yard wall reads better a broken shield than vinegar's bellyache, suggesting many recruits rued the bitter draught. Historians still argue how harsh these punitive practices really were, and whether they improved cohesion or bred resentment. As dusk falls, you trudge back through the camp gates, your limbs cramped, your face streaked with grime and sweat. Recruits collapse onto straw pallets, their whispered prayers and groans mingling in the night air. You realize that without unyielding resolve and iron discipline, no recruit survived beyond his first campaign. Because in the Roman Empire, military drill discipline was not mere routine. It was an unforgiving crucible where weakness broke under lash and iron wills emerged to carry the empire's standards across continents. You slip from the disciplined camp into a narrow alley festooned with rattling jars and shady stalls, a makeshift clinic where self-proclaimed healers hawk miraculous remedies to any willing or desperate ear. A half-dozen tables hold vials of colored potions, sacks of ground roots, and gleaming scalpels displayed without shame. You trudge among anxious supplicants with fevered brows, their hands tight on coins, as quacks in cedar oil-stained tunics peddle their panaceas. Because now it is time for quack medicine. Horrors. In mainstream Roman medical tradition, physicians trained in Hippocratic schools treated ailments with herbal concoctions, diet, and exercise. Yet unlicensed practitioners, iatromantes, and itinerant soothsayers offered far more sensational cures. You watch one purveyor brandish a vial of Dionysian elixir, claiming it contains distilled lion's mane to restore virility. He plunges a feather into a bowl of steaming liquid, flicks it onto a supplicant's forehead, and proclaims instant vigor. This fringe spectacle, while entertaining, owed little to empirical knowledge and more to showmanship, yet attracted crowds desperate for relief. Historians still argue whether any such elixirs delivered even placebo benefit or simply lined pockets. Beside him, a woman in a painted mask chops mandrake root into a bowl. She warns that the vapors will induce prophetic visions, then forces nearby children to inhale deeply. Mainstream texts acknowledge mandrakes' sedative properties, but warn of hallucinations and fatal overdoses. A stray vellum note from a provincial curator warns that 2 barn workers died after a single sniff, an incident still cited in scholarly debates over mandrake's true dangers versus exaggerated rumors. At the next table, a grizzled quack slices open a live eel, mixing its blood into a poultice for gout sufferers. He assures them the poultice draws out poison through the skin. Though fish-based salves feature marginally in Greco-Roman herbal compendia, no mainstream physician endorsed live eel blood. Yet dozens of letters in private papyri attest to patients reporting relief. Historians still argue whether any active compound existed or the effect rested solely on desperate hope. You trudge on passing a vendor who sells phoenix ash powder, dust from burned exotic feathers promised to cure sciatica. His scales weights wobble suspiciously as he measures each dose. Fringe soothsayers claimed true phoenix ash contained potent rebirthing magic, though mainstream science recognized no such bird. Scholars remain divided on whether phoenix lore ever inspired real pharmacological inquiry or remained purely mythical pabulum. A man with trembling limbs stumbles forward, handing over savings for a vial of Aesculapian nectar, distilled snake venom said to cure paralysis. The purveyor smirks as he draws the clear liquid. 1 drop, he says, then expect full mobility. Mainstream accounts show the Romans understood venomous properties well enough to treat snake bites, but using venom therapeutically was rare and dangerous. A fringe gossip pamphlet records at least 1 poisoning death when a greedy seller skipped the antidote step, sparking debates over regulation that lasted into late imperial decrees. You step toward a rudimentary operating table where a barber surgeon, his apron mottled with old blood, readies a sharpened obsidian blade to remove a client's cataract. Mainstream surgical manuals describe couching techniques using bronze needles, but this crude, jagged stone method risked infection and blindness. A patient's diary laments the agony and permanent vision loss, igniting scholarly debates on whether Roman surgeons appreciated antisepsis enough to perform such delicate operations, or if patients simply accepted blindness as occupational hazard. The alley narrows to a dead end, lined with broken amphorae and discarded leech jars. You trudge through the refuse and slip past a final stall where a so-called blood purifier is nothing more than diluted wine scented with herbs. Yet desperate folk queue for vials, hopeful it will cleanse internal toxins. Mainstream physicians deprecated such panicky purgations in favor of balanced regimens. Fringe pamphlets decried doctors as greedy for refusing to sell purifiers at premium prices. Scholars still argue whether quack cures pressured Orthodox practitioners to adopt stricter standards or simply muddied public trust. Exiting the alley into a busy crossroad, you pause to steady your nerves, your sandals sticky with unguents, and your purse lighter. You realize that without skepticism and a strong stomach, no traveler survived a single day amid Rome's quack medicine horrors. Because in the Roman Empire, illicit healers offered everything from venom vials to mythical ashes remedies that risked life and coin alike, reminding all that genuine medicine was precious and perilous among pseudo-scientific charlatans. You slip away from the shadowed alley of quacks and wander toward the rising columns of a temple precinct, where the scent of burning laurel and cedar smoke drifts heavy on the breeze. Priests in linen robes chant elaborate hymns to the gods, Jupiter, Mars, and the lesser-known deities of local shrines, while worshippers press coins into gilded hands and sprinkle cakes of barley flour at bronze altars. You trudge past flocks of white-palmed pilgrims clutching laurel wreaths and fat-tailed sheep led on ropes toward the sacrificial stone. In this realm of divine favor and whispered terror, human lives could be wagered on the caprice of ritual, because now it is time for religious ritual extremes. In mainstream Roman religious life, offerings of grain, wine, and livestock to the gods ensured prosperity and guidance. You see solemn priests invoke sacred formulas before sacrificing a bull at the altar of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, its blood collected in a polished bronze bowl and cast onto the flames in ornate patterns, a practice recorded by Livy and Cicero. These communal rites repeated on festival days, like the Ludi Romani, reinforced social bonds and political unity. Yet fringe rumors spoke of secret midnight ceremonies in the temple of Magna Mater, where human youths, chosen by lot, were offered as gatekeepers to chthonic deities, a practice the Senate officially banned. A cryptic reference in a Greek historian's footnote hints that at times of extreme crisis, a single life might be surrendered to ensure the city's safety. Historians still argue whether such human sacrifices ever occurred or were moral panics fueled by foreign accounts of barbarian customs. You trudge deeper into the precinct, where a festival of Bacchus erupts in euphoric frenzy. Devotees, women, and freedmen, clad in ivy, dance the ecstatic Bacchic rites, drums pounding like distant thunder. Mainstream edicts regulated these bacchanalia banned in 186 BCE, for fear they undermined public order, yet private worship persisted in hidden groves. Fringe accounts in senatorial decrees accuse masked revelers of plotting sedition beneath the vine-drenched arches. Scholars still debate how political anxiety colored reports of moral decay at these festivals. A sudden clang alerts you to an offering at the altar of Mars Ultor. A volunteer, usually a condemned gladiator, granted a reprieve, steps forward to reenact mythic combat before a cheering crowd, his sword flashing in sunlight. Mainstream sources note that these martial rituals honored war's patron and inspired civic valor. Yet anecdotal whispers suggest some volunteers were tricked into participation by corrupt magistrates seeking spectacle only to be slain at ritual's end. Historians still argue whether such victims truly doom lists for pageantry or simply sensational gossip. Near the temple of Vesta Vestal, virgins circle the eternal flame in silent procession, their white tunics glowing amber. Mainstream law demanded they serve 30 years keepers of Rome's hearth. Yet fringe scandalmongers claimed that any Vestal who let the flame guttered faced live burial for unchastity. A solitary poet's lament preserved the tale of Amelia, supposedly entombed beneath the earth with a handful of bread and water, though archaeological evidence for such burials is scant. Scholars still debate whether these punishments occurred or were moralizing myths to enforce celibacy. You trudge onward to the subterranean sanctuary of the lemurs, where midnight rites appease restless spirits. Black-robed families hurl beans over their shoulders and clank bronze rattles to drive wandering shades away. Mainstream farmers observed these feralia rites to ward off evil as recorded by Ovid. Yet fringe superstitions held that each bean consumed could absorb a spirit's malice, leading some to gorge on beans, until ill and extreme practice noted only in obscure village diaries. Historians still argue how seriously urban Romans took these rural customs. At the shrine of Fortuna Primigenia, pilgrims ascend steep terraces to cast bronze tokens tesserae into a deep well, hoping the clanging metal delivers prayers heavenward. Mainstream worshippers believe this ensured favor in childbirth and harvest. Yet a fringe belief whispers that some shrine attendants dredged tokens from the bottom and reused them, pocketing new offerings. A graffiti complaint scrawled near the well decries fortune's thieves, prompting debates whether temple corruption ever led to official reforms or lingered unchecked. As dusk settles, torches ignite in the temple's arches, illuminating statues of Diana and Apollo. A lone soothsayer inspects the liver haruspice from a freshly sacrificed sheep, tracing ominous patterns of lobes and fissures. Mainstream diviners used such entrail readings before battles and elections. Yet fringe critics sneered that haruspices sometimes falsified omens for bribes and accusation recorded in Scribonian letters. Scholars still argue whether misread livers were genuine errors or calculated deceptions. You trudge finally toward the outer gate, passing children wearing small charms of amber and bone amulets against the evil eye. These tokens, mainstream among all classes, hung from necks to deflect curses. Yet a fringe magic writer claimed that burying an infant's protective amulet in a neighbor's courtyard could redirect envy. Historians still debate whether clandestine amulet swapping ever triggered social strife or remained harmless folk superstition. As you step into the night air, the temple precinct's flickering shadows recede. You feel the weight of ritual, its promise of divine favor, and the lurking threat of extreme rites. Because in the Roman Empire, religious rituals were not merely ceremonies, they were arenas of civic unity and hidden terrors where divine will could bind or condemn, and only those versed in both sacred law and secret lore could navigate their perilous embrace. You slip away from the flickering temple torches and wander into a shadowed basilica of law rows of marble columns supporting vaulted ceilings carved with scales of justice. The magistrates' benches sit empty now, yet their weighty presence lingers in carved inscriptions of ancient statutes. You trudge along pillared corridors etched with legal maxims, pausing before a notice board plastered with edicts, deadlines for citizen registration, grain price caps, and decrees on moral conduct. Here, amid the hush of stained stone, the empire's most curious laws and ruthless punishments await, because now it is time for legal oddities and punishments. In mainstream Roman jurisprudence, laws were codified in the 12 tables and refined by praetors and emperors to govern everything from property rights to family affairs. You trace your finger across a bronze tablet republished in the Forum Lex Aquilia de Damnis Injuria, datum the Aquilian law on wrongful harm, guaranteeing citizens could sue for property damage or injury. This landmark provision exemplified Roman commitment to restitution. If your neighbor's cattle trampled your vineyard, you could demand compensation equivalent to the animal's value. Yet even this just framework bore peculiar edges, as local governors occasionally interpreted the law broadly to tax gladiator sponsorships or public funerals, sparking debate. Historians still argue whether the Aquilian law's flexibility reflected legal ingenuity or bureaucratic overreach. Yet for every clear statute lay a quirkier ordinance. Fringe texts in a damaged jurist's codex reveal that in one province, the lex furta Corneli imposed a penalty not on mere theft, but on failing to steal elegantly petty thieves caught with crude implements faced flogging, while those apprehended with ornate tools, silver hooks, or carved bone saws were branded on the forehead as crafty scoundrels. Scholars still debate whether this stratification of punishment aimed to shame showy criminals or simply amused magistrates with elitist cruelty. You trudge onward to a smaller chamber lined with wooden whips and bronze shackles, torture implements authorized under the edict of the praetor. Mainstream legal procedure permitted interrogation of non-citizens under torture to extract confessions, yet Roman citizens enjoyed the sacrosanct right to refuse it. You pause before a rack carved from oak beams, an apparatus that could stretch limbs for questioning. Fringe historians cite a single anecdote of a senator's son spared only after reciting Homer's entire Iliad mid-torture, a spectacle that allegedly prompted laughter in the dank hall. Historians still argue whether this legendary recital truly saved him or emerged as later poetic embellishment. Beyond torture instruments, a niche contains slender rods of birch verge, used for pedagogium, corporal punishment of slaves and children. Mainstream codes decreed up to 40 lashes for rebellious slaves. Yet freeborn minors faced similar stripes for insolence. A distasteful satire discovered in a Palatine library mocks this equality. A boy slapped by a goddess must endure twice the rod. Scholars still debate whether children's beatings were regulated with true legal restraint or inflicted at masters' whims under nominal statute. You trudge into a dimly lit antechamber where wooden stocks and metal yokes rest on stone blocks. Under the Lex Julia de Adulterius, adulterers could be bound in public stocks, their faces exposed to jeers and pelted with rotten fruit. Mainstream moral legislation under Augustus enacted such sexual morality laws to bolster family values. Yet a fringe commentary in a satirical poet's scrapbook suggests that some magistrates rented the stocks for private revels, charging fees for censure sessions that served more to fill the treasury than reform conduct. Historians still argue whether these misuse claims reflected isolated abuses or systemic corruption in moral policing. In an alcove, you see copper tubes labeled Naris fumigatio next to jars of herbal powders. These were components of fustigation punishment by forced inhalation of stinking fumes for gossipers and slanderers. Mainstream edicts stipulated up to 10 days of such therapy for those found guilty of defaming citizens' reputations. Fringe gossip sheets claim that some victims emerged with chronic sinus issues and everlasting disdain for public speaking. Scholars still debate whether fustigation was more than rhetorical justice or a little-used legal curiosity. Near the exit, a final tablet records the Lex Valeria de Repetundis, governing extortion by provincial governors. It fined and exiled any magistrate found skimming local taxes for personal profit. This mainstream anti-corruption law marks one of the empire's earliest checks on official abuse. Yet a marginal note by a provincial clerk laments that wealthy governors paid fines with ease and returned to office within months, an anecdote that fuels debate over whether legal remedies ever tempered endemic greed or simply recycled offenders. As you step into the moonlit street, the mosaic of statutes and shadows fades. You feel the weight of justice, both grand and grotesque laws that sought fairness, yet sheltered cruelty, punishments that deterred crime, yet invited abuse. Gone are the magistrates' robes, but their legacies of order and oddity linger in every etched edict. Because in the Roman Empire, legal codes were not mere texts, they were instruments of power and spectacle, where restitution and brutality coexisted, and only those astute enough to navigate statutes uncurled could hope to evade the lash or the stocks beyond the city's gleaming facade. You slip past the echo of gavels and statutes and find yourself in the bustling heart of a city market where vendors hawk garum pots, bright woolen cloaks, and coiled serpents for snake oil cures. But beneath this surface, commerce lies a constant undercurrent of pocket-picking bunco schemes and sly cons designed to relieve unwary citizens of denarii and dignity. You trudge past wooden stalls festooned with fare and fraud, alike wary of the nimble fingers gliding through coin purses. Because now it is time for marketplace, mischief, and theft. In mainstream Roman commerce, markets such as the Forum Holatorium and Forum Boarium served as regulated spaces where monthly inspections ensured weights and measures and public scales weighed cloth purchases. You see a magistrate's slave stamping bronze measures with the official key emblem confirming their accuracy. Yet despite oversight, street crime thrived. Pickpockets, known as umbrizi, blended into crowds, deftly unfastening pouches from belts with practiced ease. Ancient legal proceedings record numerous trials for larceny, with convicted thieves often sold into slavery to repay their victims. Historians still argue whether such punishments deterred petty crime or fueled a cycle of desperation. A mischievous youth darts between legs, deftly lifting a baker's earnings purse. You trudge forward just in time to see the baker's apprentice cry furtum and give chase. Fringe graffiti in a nearby alley taunts Chase the Shadow, not the man mocking both the apprentice's haste and the system's inability to catch every thief. Scholars still debate whether juvenile delinquents faced formal charges or councils quietly admonished families and returned stolen goods. At a fabric stall, a wealthy matron inspects dyed silks, vibrant purples and crimsons, coveted by patricians. You notice a faint mismatch between the cloth's width and the merchant's measure. Mainstream edicts punish condictio furtiva, the false representation of goods' weight, with fines doubled to compensate buyers. Yet an irreverent auction notice scribbled on a pillar boasts of silks sold by palps, not measures, hinting that some traders risked fines as the cost of enhanced profits. Historians still argue whether such deceit was endemic or confined to off-hours bazaars. Nearby, a snake charmer displays coiled vipers promising relief from gout through venomous pythotherapy. A fringe medical pamphlet circulated in faded scrolls recounts a case where the venom applied to the patient's wrist caused a blister so fierce that the sufferer swore off all treatments. Mainstream healers dismissed such quackery, yet the hustle of credulous onlookers ensured snake oil profits far outweighed any moral rebuke. Scholars still debate whether occasional, genuine mystical experiences among apothecaries lent quacks an aura of legitimacy. As you trudge on, you pass a line of stone benches where card sharps quietly manipulate knucklebones' tally in illicit games of chance. Officially gambling outside sanctioned festivals was punished by public flogging, yet underground dens flourished in tavern cellars. Fringe reports describe high-stakes games where senators gambled away estates under cover of darkness, only to have debts quietly forgiven by imperial patronage. Historians still argue whether such elite indulgence in vice subverted legal strictures or remained hidden courtesy of rank. A fruit vendor's cry of new figs draws you closer to a stall where he slices samples on a gleaming tray. You notice the knife has dulled edges, an old trick stainless blades more finely cut fruit, so you taste juicier figs and buy more. Mainstream merchant guilds required blade inspections to protect buyers, but some vendors evaded scrutiny by shifting markets at dawn. Fringe travelers' diaries lament such small deceits, questioning whether buyers ever caught on or simply embraced figure sweetness as worth the risk. Scholars still debate how pervasive these culinary cons were in daily life. Ahead, a stamped cloth sign offers gladiator sweat vials sold as love potions and performance enhancers. The mainstream medical consensus rejected such fetishistic cures, yet desperate suitors and athletes paid handsomely for concoctions scraped from the amphitheater floor. A satirical skit performed at a roadside theater mocked perfumes of men's valor, suggesting that such elixirs were flamboyant frauds. Historians still argue whether any compounds in gladiator sweat held measurable aphrodisiac power or survived as amusing relics of hot-blooded times. You pivot around a baker's cart stacked high with mustachium sweet cakes dusted with poppy-tinted white powder. You ask the vendor what the powder is, and he winks sugar from Sicily, rare and expensive. Mainstream import records confirm Sicily's sugar trade, yet fringe analyses of cake samples in storage jars reveal a mixture of crushed gypsum and ash used to inflate sweetness and weight. Scholars still debate whether poor quality adulterants outweighed genuine sugar use, except for the wealthiest tables. Finally, you near a small shrine to Fortuna at the market edge, where daily worshippers toss coins and whisper pleas for luck in trade and love. The ubiquitous little temple stands next to a bronze box collecting stray coins later used for public lighting or grain subsidies. Mainstream civic practice transformed market losses into civic gains, yet fringe graffiti warns fortune smiles on merchants, not pickpockets. This quip epitomizes the marketplace's double-edged nature, where fortunes shifted with every deft hand. You step back onto the main street, purse-tight senses heightened. The cries of merchants fade behind you, but the risk of misplaced trust and nimble fingers lingers. Because in the Roman Empire, the marketplace was not merely a place of trade, it was a theater of cunning, where honest commerce mingled with mischief, and only those alert to every ruse could guard their goods, their denarii, and their dignity beneath the empire's vibrant veneer. You slip away from the clamor of the marketplace and ascend marble steps into the imperial palace district, where laurel-wreathed statues of past emperors loom between polished columns. Courtiers glide past on polished sandals, their silk tunics shimmering with thread of gold. Gleaming bronze doors open onto sunlit peristyles, and you trudge across mosaic floors depicting Augustus's victories. Yet behind every column lurks ambition, envy, and the whisper of poison. Because now it is time for imperial court intrigue. In mainstream imperial protocol, courtiers vied for favor through public oratory gift-giving at tribunals and ritual attendance at the emperor's daily audience salutatio. You see senators bowing with practiced grace, presenting wreaths of purple-dipped laurel, a standard tribute recorded by Cassius Dio. Yet for every formal salute, shadowy backstairs dealings unfolded in hidden corridors where whispers trumped fanfares. A fringe rumor claims that a favorite palace scribe, once lavished with emerald rings, was overheard plotting a rival's downfall by slipping a small golden token into the empress's prayer urn, a token etched with a curse. Historians still argue whether such occult sabotage ever advanced real accusations or survived as sensational gossip among eunuchs who staffed the inner chambers. You trudge past a row of ivory thrones set for the imperial family's morning ceremony. A gaudy brocaded freedman drifts near the far wall, clutching scrolls sealed with the prefect's signet. Mainstream records show that imperial freedmen handled petitions and could recommend clients for office. Yet fringe accounts hint that some manipulated petitions, rubbing their thumbs over seals to alter names, effectively setting false charges against unwanted rivals. Scholars still debate how often such tampering occurred and whether any emperor discovered it firsthand. A sudden hush falls as the Praetorian prefect strides into the peristyle, his armor gleaming. Courtiers curtsy, some dip their hands into the pond's reflective pool and cross themselves. Mainstream texts note the prefect's role in palace security and imperial succession. Yet fringe chronicles whisper that during one succession crisis, the prefect simply locked the palace gates for 3 days, holding senators and magistrates hostage until they agreed on a favored heir. Historians still argue whether this bold maneuver saved the empire from civil war or merely replaced one tyrant with another. You trudge along a corridor hung with tapestries of conquered peoples, their faces turned to stone. Here, chamberlains offer wine flavored with guest of honor spices. An imperial steward pours a goblet for a visiting dignitary, then glances furtively at a bronze flask in his sleeve. Fringe medical formularies speak of quick-acting sleep draughts disguised as spiced wine, allegedly used to incapacitate troublesome ambassadors. Scholars still debate whether any such drugged feasts ever shifted diplomatic outcomes or remained the stuff of scandalous rumor. Near an open balcony, you glimpse the emperor's private gardens beyond carved balustrades. A noblewoman slips a folded note into a vine-woven knot, a secret message to a conspirator at the next feast. Mainstream legal codes forbade private correspondence of state secrets. Yet clandestine letters were smuggled in cypress boxes through slave tunnels. A surviving letter, smudged and partially burnt, reveals plans for a midnight coup, though the plot was foiled when a guard noticed smoldering embers on a page. Historians still argue how extensive palace espionage ran and whether any emperor truly felt secure. As midday sun glints off silver platters and lined courtyards, a trumpet summons an audience. Courtiers file in, eyes bright to await the emperor's word. Yet at the emperor's table, poison wine, a mix of ground hellebore and bitter aconite, is said to rest hidden behind a velvet screen. A fringe account in a disgraced senator's will warns his heirs, trust no chalice but your own cup. Scholars still debate whether emperors guarded their tables with poison tasters as a formal precaution, or whether this practice was exaggerated to terrorize the timid. You trudge through the peristyle noting carved reliefs of past intrigues, the blinding of rivals, the exile of offending kin. In one niche, a statue of a beloved empress holds a scroll inscribed Vestigia Pugni, traces of battle, suggesting her own role in palace strife. Mainstream honorific inscriptions often sanctified imperial women as paragons of virtue, yet fringe satirists credited some with orchestrating tribunatial purges from silk-draped shadows. Historians still argue whether these empress-led machinations guided imperial policy or remained rumors fueled by senatorial resentment. Finally, you step into the heating glow of the Domus Aurea's golden halls, where gilt ceilings reflect the day's last light. Courtiers cluster voices low, discussing the next anniversary games and who will sponsor them. In their laughter, you hear ambitions echo, an endless game of favor and fear. Because in the Roman Empire, the imperial court was not merely a stage for ceremony, it was a labyrinth of whispered secrets, veiled threats, and deadly alliances, where only the cunning and the vigilant could hope to navigate beyond a single sunrise. You slip from the palace's glittering corridors as dusk deepens into inky twilight and step onto a nearly deserted street where flickering oil lamps cast long, quivering shadows. Silk drapes hang half-closed across vestibules, and shuttered shop fronts bear rusted bolts. An owl's hoot echoes off limestone walls, mingling with distant howls from the city's outskirts. You trudge onward, senses sharpened, knowing that under Rome's moonless nights, even familiar streets transform into dangerous territory, because now it is time for nighttime hazards. In mainstream urban vigil practices, the city-appointed vigil's watchmen divided into cohorts that patrolled each of Rome's 14 regions by night. Armed with clubs and torches, they enforced curfews, quelled minor fires, and responded to alarms. You see a pair of vigils trudging opposite you, their lanterns bobbing whistles at the ready to signal an alert. Official records note that their presence cut some petty crime, yet manpower was thin. Each cohort covered vast neighborhoods. Yet even under vigilant eyes, fringe dangers thrived. Bandits, some mere cut purses, others hardened thieves, sought dark alleys and blind corners to strike. A whispered rhyme among late-night tavern patrons warns, by lantern's glow keep cloak drawn tight, or lose your purse and your sight by midnight. Historians still argue whether bandit attacks were everyday occurrences or sensationalized fears stoked by gossip mongers. You trudge past shuttered taverns as a faint skirmish breaks out near a collapsed fountain. Two figures, one cloaked, one in a tunic stained with wine, dart apart under torchlight. The wine-stained man hurls a furious oath as the cloaked stranger snatches his coin purse. Mainstream law codes treated theft at night as a capital offense, yet convictions were rare. Victims often lacked witnesses willing to testify. Fringe street posters claim that some victims paid hush money to avoid public shame. Anecdotes scholars still debate as evidence of informal justice. A sudden rustle in a vacant lot draws your gaze. You trudge carefully toward the sound and catch a fleeting glimpse of a dog, or perhaps a feral wolf, slipping behind a broken pillar. Stray dogs abounded in Rome's districts, scavenging refuse for scraps. Occasional wolf packs descended from nearby hills, attacking lone travelers at dawn or dusk. Mainstream rural advice urged travelers to carry a burning torch. Yet a stray torch spark once ignited a sleeper's cloak, nearly consuming him before neighbors woke. Historians still argue whether wolf attacks within the city were isolated frontier incidents or part of a broader wildlife encroachment. Your sandals echo on a narrow street where a merchant's crate lies overturned. Broken amphora shards litter the paving stones. You trudge forward warily and see glinting steel, an abandoned dagger. A recent brawl, perhaps, or worse. You pocket the dagger's hilt as evidence, recalling that city watch stations offered small rewards for weapons turned in. Yet fringe graffiti claims that some daggers returned to vigil stations found their way back into criminal hands. Whispers historians still debate as sign of corruption. Ahead, An ominous hush blankets the theater of Pompey, its semicircular seating dark and silent. A lone guard slouches by a wrought iron gate, yawning as he leans on his pilum. Floodlight torches long since extinguished the massive stone edifice, reeks of forgotten spectacles. Mainstream patrols rarely ventured inside closed theaters, leaving them magnets for furtive lovers or pickpockets staging ambushes in the dark. Fringe rumors speak of secret cult gatherings beneath the stage, yet historians still debate whether any illicit rites truly took place or if they were inventions of scandal-hungry chroniclers. You trudge into a twisting vicus where high walls narrow the sky to a sliver of moon. A sudden screech echoes as a falling roof tile plummets, nearly grazing your cloak. Overhead rooftop tiles shifted in yesterday's storm become deadly projectiles. Mainstream building codes, rarely enforced, required regular maintenance, yet many homeowners cut corners, ignoring loosened tile bans. Fringe court petitions reference injuries from stray tiles, prompting debates on whether official edicts ever improved rooftop safety or remained mere paperwork. A soft cry for help drifts from behind a boarded-up storefront. You trudge toward it, heart pounding, and find a young woman clutching her wrist where a knife nicked her hand. A would-be assailant flees into the shadows, heel sparks on pavement. Mainstream criminal courts treated assaults on women with special severity, yet prosecutions were hampered by women's reluctance to testify publicly. Fringe legal pamphlets advocate private oaths in sanctuaries as evidence, and innovation scholars still debate for its religious overtones versus legal validity. As you near the Suburra district, infamous for dens of iniquity, the lantern light dims further. Swallowed by dense intimacy of closely packed dwellings, you catch an unsettling scent of fermenting wine, opium smoke, and human sweat. Pickpockets and prostitutes line narrow alleys preying on drunken revelers. Mainstream regulations attempted to confine brothels to red light districts, but demand and bribes rendered enforcement patchy. Fringe verses in erotic poetry praise hidden doorways for passionate encounters, complicating moral censure. Historians still argue whether regulatory attempts ever curtailed vice or simply drove it deeper underground. Finally, you step onto the raised pavement of a main thoroughfare as distant church bells mark the witching hour. The city seemed to hold its breath, every gate latched, every street nearly deserted. Your dagger rests heavy at your side, your cloak drawn tight, your senses primed for sudden threats. Because in the Roman Empire, night was not merely darkness, it was a realm of stealth, surprise, and survival, where only those alert to every shadow and prepared for every peril could hope to make it through until dawn. The lamplit streets fade into memory as you find a quiet corner in your chamber, the city's hush settling around you like a soft cloak. Breathe deeply, Feel each inhale sweep away the dust and danger of marble alleys, strenuous drills, and unseen threats. Imagine the oil lamps dimming one by one, their flicker softening into distant glow. Recall the dawn crowds of Rome's teeming streets, the clang of swords in gladiatorial schools, the spicy perfumes and perilous feasts in triclinium halls, the steamy trials of thermae, the roar of chariots and swirl of sewage, the crack of whips and hiss of bribes, the hush of midnight cults, and the bandits lurking beneath silent arches. Each scene has reverberated through your mind, a tapestry of marvel and misery woven within the empire's shining facade. Now feel those visions gently recede, drawing inward like cicadas seeking slumber. Let the cool air of your room brush your skin, dial down the day's heartbeat, and welcome the soft sigh of restful calm. Your pulse slows, your muscles unwind, and even the dagger at your side feels heavy with disuse. Know that Rome's might and menace remain beyond these walls, yet here in your serene retreat, you are safe. Drift on memories, transformed into whispers each one, a stepping stone across the empire's vast expanse, and back to this moment of peace. Close your eyes and let the final echoes of ancient crowds and distant howls dissolve into silence. Rest now in the hush of night's embrace, where no scandal or shadow can follow you. Sleep awaits beyond these gates of marble and memory. Sweet dreams, and may tomorrow's dawn find you well and unscathed. End of script. Sweet dreams.